Mr. President, governors and friends, it's great to be back in the transformed city of Asaba. I've entitled my address, Mission the Future. And I must begin by thanking you for the honor of this invitation to address you. I'm glad that I did not have to decline, pleading the truthful excuse that I am unfortunately still saddled with a heavy load of unfinished business elsewhere. In any case, I've come to accept that it is a condition of human existence to be saddled with this particular affliction, unfinished business, that sense of an incomplete mission. The difference between one individual and the next is perhaps that some know this, while others do not. With individuals, this distinction does not matter a great deal. We go into retirement with a sigh of mission accomplie, convinced that one's self-imposed, fortuitous, or mysteriously transmitted mission in life has indeed been fulfilled. Perhaps we simply shrug our shoulders in resignation, saying enough is enough. Let others take over from here. No matter the variant, we are still buried with our own self-assessment, accurate or misconceived. A sense of mission and the identification of such a mission varies from individual to individual, from institution to institution, from community to community, with or without relationship to one's social status or formal responsibilities. For instance, you might read that the United Nations is sending a fact-finding mission to the Sudan to check on al-Bashir's compliance with its latest directives, or that Amnesty International has sent a fact-finding mission to Burma to see whether or not the Burmese military dictators were truly easing up on their stranglehold on Burmese democracy, ensure that the mere concession of an electoral exercise or the release of the opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi is not mere cosmetic, an excuse to clamp others down into detention or retain despotic powers by other means. Peace missions or peace initiatives, sometimes known in the latest Nigerian parlance as peace advocacy, are also just as commonplace. A former head of state in this nation went on what he considered a peace advocacy mission to a group of rampaging psychopaths who had laid siege to the nation. We may argue from here to eternity about the appropriateness of that mission, especially its timing, but at least he had some credentials for his undertaking, and it would appear that the proposal came anyway from those who thought, over there, rationally or with pathetic naivete, that he might play a useful role in stemming the tide of blood. The former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, was sent on a mission to Syria in an attempt to stop the butcher of Damascus using his people for target practice, an endeavor to bring both sides to the negotiating table. Peace missions or advocacy come in various shapes and guises. Quite a number of them are self-ascribed. Many successful ones, such as, for instance, that undertaken by a little-known Irish group, worked quietly, unpublicized but effectively, to bring an end to the decades-long civil war in Mozambique. By contrast, there are others which only end up afflicting their target areas with all the bristling paraphernalia of war, who appropriate to themselves a disproportionate amount of the security resources of a nation to inflict peace on a perfectly peaceful environment, and with maximum gaudiness and ostentation. Variously also deflected as a thank you mission, they move from state to state with all the extravagant baggage and panoply of feudal potentates visiting vassal states. They seize up traffic in throbbing commercial capitals, bring all motion to a halt, insisting on a gift of peace on a state which never evinced any indications of warfare nor asked for peace evangelism. The places where the nation may be said to be at war are known all over the world, not just within Nigeria, but they do not venture there. No, it is to states which are in the throes of peace, which evince no need of peace healing, that the ministrations of such peace physicians lead what end up memorably as carnivalesque caravans of disruption. Traffic is tied up, security is tied up, productive motion is tied up, commerce is tied up, governance is tied up, security is tied up. Individual, corporate, even leisure schedules are tied up, all to pander to bristling head ties tied up in a floating parade of gorgeous fabric, sterile, provocative, and contemptuous of the rights of others on their own desperate mission, the mission of generating the life-sustaining muscle for family and self. A vanity parade, born perhaps of boredom or a feeling of neglect. This banal extravaganza, which attained obscene heights with the military, has transferred to our supposedly democratic environment under various pretexts, guzzling funds and guzzling up productive time of others. Productive motion is held to stand still. Citizen rights are trampled upon. This disrespectful misappropriation of public space and citizen rights attained unprecedented heights under the military. They have no place in a democratic setting, especially when organized by the unelected mere appendages to constitutional power. It has become a culture of spousal aggression that can only beget a response of disrespect and ridicule from those who are thus affected. There are numerous, far more creatively effective ways of bringing the train of peace evangelism to places in need or not in need, and these do not involve the usurpation of the daily mission of millions by the mission of any one individual. Now, where were we? Oh yes, we were embarking on the theme of missions. Every individual does have, or is entitled to have, his or her own self-assessment of the level of achievement of a life mission. It does not matter in the least what that mission might be. The sense of satisfaction in the fulfillment of that mission or regrets about its non-fulfillment remain primarily an individual assessment, and one that accompanies each individual to his or her grave. With nations, however, there is little room for such indifference. And the reason is simple. Individuals vanish, but nations endure, at least in one form or another. And nations impact on the quality of existence of each transient occupant. Each occupant, therefore, has a stake in the fortunes of the nation, a stake that, proportionately speaking, equates the eternity that we have optimistically considered to the normal lifespan of the nation. The unfinished business of nation being is thus not one to which we as individuals can afford to remain indifferent. In many more ways than we like to admit, the nation defines its citizen. This means that the citizen remains unfinished, a creature in a limbo of identity, leading an improvised, unsecured, and uncertain existence until the nation itself can boast of a recognizable and functional identity. I do not refer merely to unfinished business, as in governance business, policy making, planning, execution, and so on. No, I refer to that far more fundamental, unobtrusive, but nonetheless comprehensive business of nation being. Some nations are wise enough to acknowledge their state of incompletion and take steps, even while the business of governance remains uninterrupted, to tackle this essential business head-on, addressing the very history that brought them into being and examining the factors, both positive and negative, that have shaped their existence since they began to recognize and conduct themselves as nations. Others muddle on, immured in an impenetrable carapace of complacency. They list their achievements, both internal and external: economic buoyancy, a prestigious foreign policy, low level of unemployment, a highly literate society, eradication of diseases, uninterrupted electric power, potable water, and other indices of enhanced civic life. Even perhaps IMF and World Bank approbation as proof of the fact that they have arrived and can confidently assess themselves as nations beyond the mere naming. They refuse to recognize that some, at least, but not necessarily all, but some part of a suppressed social malaise or political fractiousness can be traced to the basic issue of the unfinished aspect of their self-constitutive process. And this includes even those who cannot even boast of these medals of achievement, those who long after any self-respecting nation should have been weaned continue to insist that their endemic negative symptoms are merely teething problems. Such nations are clearly on a self-destruct trajectory. Permit me to cite as analogy the ordeal of one of my children, who one day during a routine basketball game collapsed and passed out. Until then, he had experienced intermittent breathing problems. These were put down as mere mild asthmatic attacks, allergy, etc., etc. Until then, however, nothing as drastic as an actual faint had ever occurred. Fortunately, one of the paramedics who were called to the scene felt that this was more than a mere asthmatic attack or something equally benign, and so began a series of tests which merely increased the bafflement of the diagnostic clinics and specialists. A period of round-the-clock monitoring was prescribed. He was banned from any further sporting activities, and strapped to a gadget which monitored his movements everywhere, with direct radio links to the clinic and ambulance, etc., etc., if any recurrence took place. All this while, the various images of heart, lungs, all parties, full body scan, etc., brain scans were subjected to analysis. The trouble was that some of these scans gave up contradictory images, which drove the doctors to distraction. In the end, the mystery was solved. His condition was a heart tumor, but not just any tumor. It was one of those tumors, very rare, which flatten themselves against the wall of the heart and change shape, disappearing from time to time. The decision for an open heart surgery was only the beginning. The surgical team had to go back to school, contact other surgeons, other cases, look for other similar cases, all the way to Canada from the United States. In the end, his heart was taken out, open heart surgery. It's quite an experience to see your son's heart taken out separately, pulsing, while it was strapped to an artificial heart to keep the blood pumping to his system, etc., etc. I won't give you all the details, but the lessons are what are important. The lesson one is this, and this is the reason I've given you these details. If that youth, that young man, had been in this country, he would be dead. We all know that. You and I know that. He would be dead by now. The second one, and this lesson reminds us of why, presumably, we've all been brought here today. It's similar realities which compel you to demand of yourselves what is missing from the delivery of responsible governance, and thus to seek strategies for their fulfillment. Second lesson, which is even more fundamental, many of us have similar stories of marginal deliverance. Others have far more disastrous, more tragic stories. We'd never had a happy ending. But the analogy is the more important. It goes deeper than the mere incidental vagary of the health of one individual. It concerns the corporate bodies, the body. Because even the greatest pundits can be wrong about the health of any organism, human, institutional, or national. I'm speaking here of the deceptiveness of appearances. I think those of you who are soccer addicts who've been following recently the collapse of a footballer on an Italian footballer on the soccer field. No evidence of any illness until he collapsed and died. We've had a tragedy here also. Remember Kano, similar instant, sudden death. And with individuals, institutions are no different. It happens all the time. Just recall how the banking system in the most advanced countries suddenly collapsed, creating a domino effect that saw seemingly robust economies collapse one after the other. But again, we're simply speaking of parts of the system, working parts of the functioning totality. A deep malaise may defy the most astute diagnostic minds, leading to a complacent reading of its state of health. If, however, there's a sound, fundamental, agreed structure that holds the totality together and binds the totality together, that totality, that healthy totality, will override faulty mechanisms of the parts. This is what is pulling many European nations out of the economic rut. Lucky, therefore, is that entity that is urged from time to time to examine and re-examine the very walls, tissues, and muscles of the heart that pump blood into the system. That it is beating sturdily does not mean that there are no tumors embedded within its very interstices, waiting its moment to strike while bounding confidently from one project to another, from one field of undertaking to the next, overriding one hidden trauma after another, but progressively weakened by each trauma-inducing experience. Most mortals do need to be left alone to find their feet after any traumatic experience. The nation is no different. The traumatic experience in the Nigerian instance being several, the Civil War in particular, and then years and years of military aberration. There's also the affliction of illegitimacy, the dubious legitimacy, speaking now practically, of a large percentage of representatives of the people's supposed political will at the center, at the federal and national assemblies, and even in some lodges of executive governors. The percentage of occupational illegitimacy we know has decreased over the last elections. But we do know, and they know that we know, that quite a large percentage of the so-called honorables, senators, and governors could never have smelt the varnish on the seat they now occupy under normal conditions. Some of these are the most vociferous, most assiduous in their denunciation, indeed, demonization of the very notion of a convocation of peoples. That is, a genuine convocation outside the sanctuary, privilege, and self-interest of the houses of illegitimacy. The convocation of a people who wish to examine their present and decide their future. Let me declare here that I've taken a decision never again to add my voice to that call for a national conference, having joined with others, two of whom are now dead, to let the judiciary pronounce, at the very least, to pronounce a symbolic judgment on whether or not what now passes for a people's constitution is indeed such a product of a people's will, or yet another product of illegitimacy hung around the nation's neck like a noose. That I shall no longer add my voice to that call, however, does not mean that I abandon the right to examine, even as a contextual exercise, the antecedents of that call, its provocation, the distortions it has endured and continues to endure, the potential consequence of its rejection, and perhaps the hidden motivations of opposing or evasive voices. Northwards from this very spot where we're gathered, a daily decimation of our humanity pronounces its diabolical judgment on the structure that still struggles to deserve the name nation, calling in question through its fiery monologues the very legitimacy of our nation being. Let me take this opportunity, however, to stress to all within the nation that this ongoing catastrophe is not the burden of any one part of the nation by itself, but a fight for survival of the totality of its humanity. The antecedents of the present national crisis may seem particularized. The carnage concentrated on a geographical sector, at least for now. The solution, nonetheless, remains the responsibility of the entirety of the constituent parts. There is an immeasurable gulf between taking up arms against the state and declaring war on humanity. I recall a cry from a stricken heart, metaphorically speaking this time, not literally, when the United States of America invaded Iraq under the pretext of looking for weapons of mass destruction. The Arab League happened to be holding its session at the time, and its Secretary General was reported to have exclaimed, "The inhabitants of hell have been let loose," or words to that effect. Several members of that league thought that he was being merely alarmist. The US President, George Bush, certainly thought so too, especially once he had overrun the defenses of the deluded tyrant Saddam Hussein. Several years later, not merely the Middle East, but the entire world is still attempting to cope with the rampages of the successors of those fiends from hell, now scattered all over the world, unleashed, admittedly, through past global defaults, but also ministering to their own innate demonism, determined to drag the rest of the world down into their own private and collective hells. What applied to Iraq is both pertinent to and apparent in Nigeria, evade it how we will. The rejects, even of hell, have indeed been let loose. But many prefer to shy away from the question, who let them loose? How long was the present scenario in preparation? For how long was the mindset of its direct perpetrators nurtured? For how long were impressionable young minds doctored, warped, and then homicidally refocused? Was it through secular ideological indoctrination, let us say a Marxist revolutionary orientation? Or was it through the theocratic, serving, however, the secular power obsession of a minority? These are basic inquiries that should precede all searches for remedy. But the nation has elected, in the main, to climb above the conveyance of evasion bound for the bunker of denial. Those who unleashed the denizens of hell are among us. They did not come from outer space. They're known, and they know where their myrmidons retreat while they prepare their next outrage on the populace. I invite you, for instance, to take a hard look at the photos of those killers of the Italian and British hostages, finally trapped in Kaduna. Do you really seriously think that they and hundreds like them are independent actors in the ongoing rampages? Does anyone still believe that they sponsored themselves for training to training grounds on this continent or outside in some infernal regions for their deadly mastery of weapons of human evisceration? Their sponsors are not phantoms. They're real. They exist among us. But phantoms or not, today they are afraid. Their own agents of destruction have turned upon them demanding evidence of preparations for this theocratic utopia that was dangled before them. A utopia founded on a theocratic myopia that nerved them to acts of total disregard for fellow humanity and a passion for self-immolation. How do we disable such forces? Let me begin with the negative, not by appeasement, not by utterances or gestures of appeasement. Those who seek to dominate others do not understand the language of appeasement. To them, it translates as endorsement, multiplies their self-righteousness, and urges them to even greater acts of contempt for humanity. Dialogue is a cultured, always commendable device in principle. However, let me use that theme of dialogue to call attention to a fervent contradiction within this general field that appears to have escaped certain among our pundits of appeasement and dialogue at all costs. Here it goes. On the one hand, those very voices are on their knees urging dialogue on the assailants. On the other, those whose call for dialogue, but on a wider national scale, holds out the possibility, at the very least, of a holistic apprehension of the far-reaching causes and prescriptions for remedial action for the guarantee of a future, are told to go and have their heads examined. Therein lies the contradiction. A force for blind violence comes to the fore, a force that manifests utter contempt for that very civilized facilitator of coexistence called dialogue, yet hardly had the first prickle of blood been drawn before the chorus goes up. Let's invite them to sit down and talk. Please tell us what you want and we'll see what can be done. And even before that, there were already calls for amnesty. The sequence is important. Let us keep that in mind. Now, what is this supposed to indicate? It is only through the language of terror that one can make oneself heard in this nation. Two sovereignties, the ordination of two competing sovereign states, one pleading for dialogue, the other contemptuous of that very word. Yes, sovereignty, that was the word I used. The sovereignty of the nation we are lectured is non-negotiable. And that mystic possession, sovereignty, will be imperiled if the constituent parts of the nation do indeed embark on a dialogue of free peoples. It's a very portly word, sovereignty, mouth-filling and chest-expanding. It is designed to stop all arguments. Merely pronounce that a form of action is a threat to the illusionary banquet called sovereignty, and the world is supposed to go into seizure from sheer surfeit. One can only marvel at what happened to this patrimony of sovereignty when a Buhari or a Babangida or a Sani Abacha terminated preceding sovereign claims with a mere radio announcement accompanied by a martial tune. Some of the more hysterical among our current voices, opposed to a people's dialogue, did not wait for the military spittle to dry out of the airwaves before they vanished into the obscurity of their villages. In this case, however, today, dialogue as a voluntary undertaking, an operative stage in nation being, as an expression of collective will, increasingly voiced, even in hitherto unexpected sectors, is being derided. Sadly, very sadly, one can sometimes understand causes for the vilification of this recourse. Only a few days ago, the clamor for this dialogue, the genuine one, was joined by one of the most nauseous and obsequious self-ingratiating servitors of the repellent dictatorship of Sani Abacha. Such incidental bedfellows make one despair. But as we say, this is democracy. And even those who seek to sanitize their past by cynical revision of a history through which we all lived and survived, thank goodness, must be given a hearing. The message, not the messenger, must be our meager consolation. I merely play the devil's advocate. I've lost all interest in the call for a national conference. And it is better to move onto the more pertinent aspect of our commitment, which is the future. And what do we see when we look at the future? Peril. A future where the intangible yet reinforced concrete pillar of civilized society, such as justice, has become available on the open market. I'm making no new assertions here, don't take my word for it. Revert to internal motions for reforms, such as the Justice Ashaw Commission of Inquiry into the judiciary, and also call to mind various positions and pronouncements of the National Bar Association. Ask yourselves how it comes about that one of your former members of this very governorship consortium is currently basking in immunity, having succeeded in obtaining a judicial injunction against prosecution for his crimes against this future we're talking about, perpetrated while in office. Do we need to point out that as a nation, we're covered with shame in that it took an external court of justice of the former colonial overlords to finally put an end to the costly shenanigans of another of your former brother governors, one who held the forces of anti-corruption at bay in this very region, led them a merry dance all the way to Dubai, and he was plucked out of his imagined sanctuary. And what of that judge? The judge who freed him of all 170 charges right here in this very nation, pronounced him innocent of blasting the very future of the generations under his watch by a career of systematic, unconscionable robbery. Why are we surprised, therefore? Why are we surprised to find ourselves faced with a future where all sense of community has all but evaporated and only predators roam the streets, making their own laws of survival as they proceed? Yes, they make their own laws. Even these know that without law, written or unwritten, there is no community. And without community, all talk of nation is vain. Nations are built on the palpable operations of community. Otherwise, they are empty, artificial, and hollow. They collapse with the tiniest pinpricks of unrest. They drift into oblivion with the slightest winds of external pressure. And so, that learned judge who held the strings of community in his hands, the judge who pronounced our elusive governor free of all blemish, that custodian and administrator of justice. Our question today is he still passing judgments in this nation, or has he proceeded on leave to Dubai? Permit me to recall an exercise in a minor key in one's seeming obsession with the future, which of course I continue to see as the immutable responsibility of the present. Otherwise, what is the present all about? In the early years of the return of nation to civilian rule, I was invited to take part in a rather imaginative form of mentoring initiated by a Japanese television station, loaded with a grandiose name, Super Teachers. It involved having a selected group of teachers, not necessarily teachers by profession, just take a group of pupils under their wing for a number of weeks. Those teachers were selected on the basis of their disciplines. They were free to decide on a school, and from that school extract a class, a group of pupils across classes, then expose them to aspects of their own calling. Science, technology, architecture, the performing arts, etc. Virtually all disciplines were represented, and the entire mentoring interaction was filmed. What I privately relished in that project, this is just by the way, was that it enables me till today to boast that for a few weeks at least, I was on the same payroll and salary as Bill Gates. I know that he would not have touched his honorarium, he would have thrown it away somewhere, if at all they dared offer him such pittance. However, as a man whose field is virtual reality, he'd be the first to concede to me when I claimed that, virtually speaking, we were earning the same salary from a shared project. So much for vicarious living. The program I was about to elaborate allowed for the pupils to be taken anywhere for the imparting of knowledge within the station's budget, of course. I took over a school, and my plan for them was to induct them to various aspects of my activities both in the humanities and in humanity. And so I bussed them to the Lagos House of Assembly, where I had been invited to deliver an address. Afterwards, they were free to ask questions and discuss what they were doing. And let me recite to you some of my address to the House of Assembly that day. I said, I invite you, I planted the students in the gallery, I invite you, honorable members, to look up at that gallery. You'll observe that you have some rather unusual visitors. I brought them here to observe how law is enacted, but more importantly, to see how their future is being shaped. Then I proceeded to induct the House into what the whole project was about. And then I went on. Now imagine, I said to the House of Assembly, imagine if we had gone, let us say, to Kaduna State just about a month ago. During those days that are forever branded on the memory of this nation, days of horror, when some of the desperate politicians of this nation fomented an artificial upheaval in the name of religion, a conspiracy that led to the loss of over 1,000 souls all over the nation, some in the most gruesome circumstances, both from the initial execution of meticulously planned massacres and in retaliatory acts that took place in scattered places all over the nation. Among the victims were innumerable school children who were led out of their schools and slaughtered like rams for the very guilt of innocence. Imagine if I had led these innocents into such an inferno. Tell me, just what kind of an explanation would I have made to their parents? What treasure of the learning experience would I claim was worth such a horrifying end to promising lives? It was a period that brought out the worst and bestial from our human landscape, but also the best. Let us note this very carefully. It also brought out the best, thanks to a handful of that same humanity who risked their lives to protect their fellow beings from the initial mayhem and from the retaliatory rage that was being exercised by their own kin and neighbors. Yes, indeed, this did happen, as is the case wherever the outbreak of the virus of insanity is recorded. But how pitifully meager is this consolation beside the depravity that overwhelmed the entirety of the nation. End of quote. It is 12 years since I uttered those words, and it reads like a lament that anyone could have uttered yesterday or today. Only the choice of words would be even stronger, greater rage, born of the recurrent extrusion of that hidden tumor in the very walls of the heart. A tumor that merely alters shape, contours, and size, but a tumor, nevertheless. And it is not merely religion that I have in mind, no. My busload of school children clanged forcefully, memory of that busload, clanged forcefully on the walls of my mind only some weeks ago when I read of a similar busload filled with the designated future of the nation, this time from a girls' school. That bus in Ogun State was waylaid, its occupants robbed, assaulted, and raped. That is the level of depravity to which the nation has been brought. On that road of the pupils' martyrdom was reenacted the continuum of the history of this nation: violation, rape. And who are the gangbangers of the nation's future? We know them. They are defined. We know the militant, and there are others. The others, however, very often lack immediate identification, but they're especially dangerous. But we know them, so do you all. They are the ones who, even while claiming to defend the rights and entitlements of their constituencies, do little more than defend the rights and entitlements of their privileged existence. They are the generator contractors in whose interest it is that the national electric system never works. They are the minority who conspire to run down the health system of this nation, since they can then divert its allocation to their own and their families' excursion to Wiesbaden for annual checks and fly to New York to cure the toothache. They are the ones who systematically destroyed the educational system, which we took for granted throughout our own past, that has engendered this present. They are the petroleum moguls and long-haulage monopolists who have ensured that this nation has never enjoyed the cheapest form of transport ever invented by humanity outside water, and that's the railways. These agents are the ones who see government solely as livelihood, who engage in every dirty trick in the books to ensure that government remains in their hands, since they know no other way to survive. They have never understood that a nation's economy must be generated, not printed at the central bank or simply diverted from the oil wells and central handouts. These enemies were the inventors of the rice importation scheme, the cement importation scheme, the import license scheme, the counter trade, and numerous other scan schemes that were designated not to generate productivity and ensure employment for generations, but to amass in the hands of a few the entire wealth of the nation, from which they dole out pittances to a zombie followership. But sooner or later, zombies turn, recognize that they are also creatures of flesh and blood, and then demand their pound of flesh. To all legislators, all that has been said. Let me not continue the catalogue of woes. All that has been argued, in my view, there need be no further need for recall, or indeed, to go back to the beginning, no further call for a national conference. The causes are clear, the arguments are clear, the arguments against are clear. But it was necessary for us to understand the multiple causes for the constant resurgence of this call. It is, however, time to stop barking up a wrong tree and envisage instead what motions would have characterized such a conference were it to have taken place. In other words, it is time to act the national conference, not summon it. And I believe that this is what we're witnessing today in the ongoing encounters of regional groupings. There was an earlier one in Lagos a few months ago, and hopefully these will be followed by others. All the way north, northeast, northwest towards Maiduguri, Kano, when those beleaguered sectors have ridden themselves of the horrors of mindless insurgency. My reading of what that conference would have been then is this, that central to such gatherings, including this, would be the very antithesis of the word centralize. It would be decentralization. Begin to engage in policies and strategies of development that progressively render the center reduced in its ability to impede. For this is what has been the norm. Reduce its ability to impede the pace and quality of development of the constituent parts of the nation. The constitutional envelope that currently holds the parts together should be pushed as far as possible without it actually bursting, leading to a vibrant competition and collaboration among its constituent parts. It is then left to the courts of arbitration to interpret those areas where it might appear that the envelope has been pushed too far. And let no one imagine that this is still the aberrant season of that third-term desperado and denier who defied the courts in their decision over the illegal seizure of the statutory revenue of Lagos State and some other states. The people now know what to do and have proved it. Lagos stood firm. Leadership is half the battle, but followership must also prove its mettle. Each regional grouping should, by its policies, declare an uncompromising developmental autonomy. I repeat, autonomy. Should leave the center only with its competence provenance, foreign policy, national security, and interstate affairs, including perhaps peace-subversive peace advocacy, but minus its propensity for inflicting hard seizure of unproductive human conquerors. There should be no further calls for a national conference. Let each regional grouping with compatible ideas of the ultimate mission, the future of the humanity for which they're responsible, begin to call the shots and relegate the center to its rightful dimensions in any genuine functioning federated democracy. Let each state call its own conference of peoples to articulate in just what direction they wish to direct their leaders and relate to the center and other states. Let each regional grouping and its member states single-mindedly project and pursue their strategies for the enhancement of the quality of life and the dignity of their peoples, quarry into their resources to extract the material required for their very existence, material that they can exchange among one another based on their spatial developmental advantages. In short, share among themselves areas of specialization, substituting strength for the weakness of their partners, expertise for deficiencies in one member or the other. Such collaborating states, let me stress, need not even be contiguous. What matters is to create a community of interests. Nigeria has proved too large and inefficient for the centralized identification and management of such human skills and human resources and material resources, the center having become increasingly bloated, parasitic, and alienated. Now is the time to put into practice that ancient saying, small is beautiful. We must return to the earlier days of creative rivalry that pronounces that vanishing past an interrupted project of promise, creativity, and productivity. Then it may be possible for your generation to say contentedly, even while the harvest is still distant, but the soil is seen to be cleanly prepared, the seeds implanted and germinating, to say to yourselves, mission accompli. Thank you.